The whisper drifted like a draft of frost through the dimly lit corridors of Oakridge Manor. "You bought the wrong bride," the servant girl said. The Duke smiled and offered her his hand. In the bitter November of 1888, deep within the rain-drenched valleys of Yorkshire, the ancient seat of the Duke of Blackwood stood as a monument to unyielding pride and decaying grandeur. Arthur Ravenel, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, was a man forged in the crucible of military duty and sudden tragic loss. At 32, his face bore the sharp, uncompromising angles of a man who had commanded soldiers in dusty imperial outposts, yet his dark eyes reflected the haunting loneliness of an estate burdened by staggering debt. His late father's reckless gambling had left Oakridge on the precipice of ruin. The solution was as cold and pragmatic as Victorian society demanded: a marriage of convenience to the daughter of an unimaginably wealthy Manchester industrialist. The contract had been signed in London behind locked doors. Mr. Thomas Vance, a man who traded cotton for social status, would clear every mortgage encumbering Oakridge. In return, his eldest daughter, Miss Evelyn Vance, would receive the coveted title of Duchess and an unassailable position at the very pinnacle of the peerage. Rain lashed against the tall, arched windows of the grand entrance hall as the heavy iron gates groaned open. Gas lamps flickered against polished marble, casting long shadows across the gilded portraits of Ravenel ancestors. Arthur stood at the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase, dressed in tailored black coat and crisp linen, his tall frame rigid with duty. Beside him stood his stern housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, and a line of liveried footmen, all waiting to welcome the woman who would save their noble house from public disgrace. The carriage door opened, and a figure draped in velvet and silk stepped into the downpour. Assisted by footmen, she hurried into the vestibule, shivering beneath her waterlogged cloak. But as the heavy oak doors shut out the roaring tempest, the woman did not raise her chin with the haughty assurance expected of a Manchester heiress. Instead, she stood frozen on the Persian rug, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest. When she drew back her damp bonnet, Arthur's breath caught, not from the grand spectacle of London high fashion, but from the raw, undeniable intensity of her gaze. She wore no jewels. Her hands, revealed as she nervously pulled off her soaked cotton gloves, were not soft and pampered. They bore the faint, calloused marks of honest labor. Her dark hair was neatly pinned, framing a pale, delicate face with striking amber eyes that burned with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. Arthur stepped forward, his boots echoing softly against the marble. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that held the calm authority of his rank. "Welcome to Oakridge Manor. I trust your journey from London was not entirely unbearable." The young woman stared at him, her chest heaving beneath her damp woolen bodice. She looked past the sparkling crystal chandelier, past the golden frames, and directly into the eyes of the most powerful peer in the county. "My lord," she began, her voice trembling slightly, though her gaze never wavered. "There has been a terrible deception." Mrs. Gable gasped softly in the background, but Arthur merely narrowed his eyes, stepping closer until he could smell the faint scent of rain and sweet clover clinging to her. "Deception? I am not Evelyn Vance," she said, her voice echoing clearly across the vast hall. "Evelyn fled to Paris 2 nights ago with her art tutor. Her father, desperate to avoid a scandal that would ruin his name and void your contract, forced me into that carriage in her place. He threatened to throw my elderly mother into the debtor's prison if I refused to play the part until the papers were finalized." She took a shaky breath, standing straight despite her threadbare clothes, refusing to bow her head. "You bought the wrong bride," the servant girl said. The Duke smiled and offered her his hand. The hall fell into a stunned, deafening silence. Mrs. Gable looked as though she might faint, and the footman stared straight ahead, terrified to move a muscle. A scandal of this magnitude, a housemaid passed off as a duchess to a duke, would destroy every party involved, sending shockwaves from Yorkshire to Mayfair. Yet Arthur Ravenel did not roar with rage. He did not call for the guards or cast her out into the merciless northern rain. Instead, a slow, intriguing smile transformed his severe features. A smile that reached his dark, guarded eyes for the first time in years. He saw in this young woman something he had not encountered in the stuffy drawing rooms of Kensington or the grand ballrooms of Belgravia. Absolute unvarnished honesty and selfless sacrifice. "And what is your true name, mademoiselle?" Arthur asked softly, his hand remaining extended between them, steady and warm. "Clara," she whispered, her amber eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at his outstretched palm. "Clara Sterling. I was her lady's maid." "Well, Miss Clara Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. "It appears Mr. Vance underestimated both your integrity and my discernment. But the rain is fierce, and you are shivering." He took her cold, trembling hand gently in his own, his warm fingers wrapping around hers with a strength that felt entirely like a promise. "Step inside," the Duke murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, unspoken challenge. Because whether Mr. Vance intended it or not, the game has just begun, and you are not leaving this house. Before Clara could process the warmth of his touch, the grand, heavy knocker on the outer door sounded, a sharp, frantic, demanding rhythm that reverberated through the hall, signaling the unexpected arrival of someone who was never meant to reach Oakridge tonight. The heavy iron knocker thundered against the oak doors once more, rattling the iron sconces along the grand entrance hall. Mrs. Gable hurried forward, her keyring jingling nervously at her waist, while Arthur subtly shifted his tall frame, positioning himself between Clara and the storm outside. He did not release her hand immediately. The brief, reassuring pressure of his fingers served as an unspoken shield before he stepped back into his quiet authority. "Open it, Mrs. Gable," Arthur commanded softly, his voice cutting through the tension that hung thick in the air. The heavy doors swung inward, revealing a drenched, red-faced gentleman wrapped in a heavy, fur-collared coat. It was Mr. Thomas Vance himself. His boots spattered with mud, his breathing ragged from hard riding. He burst into the vestibule, his eyes sweeping past the liveried staff until they landed on Clara. A flash of fury flared across his fleshy, pompous face. "You insolent, treacherous little creature!" Vance barked, stepping forward with his silver-topped cane raised in accusation. "I told you to keep your mouth shut until the morning. Your lordship—" Vance turned toward Arthur, bowing frantically, his wet top hat trembling in his hands. "Your lordship, I offer my deepest, most humble apologies. The girl is mad, delirious from the journey. My daughter Evelyn suffered a sudden ailment in London, and this foolish maid was sent ahead to prepare her quarters. Evelyn arrives tomorrow by train." Clara stood her ground, though her small hands clenched tightly into the folds of her wet skirt. She refused to cower. "The truth is already spoken, Mr. Vance. His Grace knows." Vance's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. "Silence! You are a penniless orphan whom my household saved from the workhouse. You will answer to the magistrate for theft and impersonation." "Enough, Mr. Vance." Arthur's voice cut through the air like a steel blade. It was not raised, but the sheer weight of his title and military presence froze the industrialist in his tracks. Arthur stepped forward, his dark eyes glittering with cold disdain under the crystal chandelier. "You stand in Oakridge Manor, shouting at a woman under my protection, while attempting to cover up a fraudulent transaction that borders on high treason against my peerage." "Your Grace?" "The contract," Vance stammered, wiping sweat and rain from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "The contract signed in London bound me to a woman of honor and a family of integrity, Arthur said, taking a slow step toward Vance, forcing the wealthy merchant to retreat back toward the open doorway. You brought a deceitful scheme to my doorstep, but Miss Sterling brought me the truth. That makes her far more valuable in this house than anything your ledger contains. She is a servant, Vance spat, his arrogance momentarily overcoming his fear. She has no family, no fortune, no name. And yet, she possesses courage, a trait visibly absent in your own conduct, Arthur replied coldly. You will leave my estate tonight, Mr. Vance. My solicitors in Mayfair will contact yours by noon tomorrow. If you attempt to molest Miss Sterling or her mother in any fashion, I will ensure that every bank in the City of London revokes your credit lines by nightfall. Do I make myself understood? Vance paled. He looked from the Duke's unyielding visage to Clara, who stared back at him with quiet dignity. Realizing he had lost the gambit, the industrialist offered a curt, bitter bow, turned on his heel, and retreated into the howling tempest. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him. Silence settled over the hall once more, broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the distant murmur of the storm. Arthur turned back to Clara. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation seemed to drain away, leaving her pale and trembling. Mrs. Gable, Arthur ordered gentle, his demeanor instantly softening. Escort Miss Sterling to the Rose Suite on the second floor. Have a fire lit, bring hot tea, and fetch dry garments from the guest wardrobes. She is to be treated as an honored guest of this house. The Rose Suite, Your Grace? Mrs. Gable asked, her eyebrows rising in aristocratic shock. That is reserved for high-born visitors. Miss Sterling is our guest, Arthur said firmly. See to it immediately. Over the next fortnight, Oakridge Manor existed in a state of suspended reality. The rain gave way to early winter snow, dusting the sprawling Yorkshire moorlands in a blanket of pristine white. Clara found herself caught in a surreal world. By day, she wandered the towering, leather-bound library, reading rare volumes of history and poetry she had only ever dreamed of touching while dusting shelves in Kensington. By night, she dined with the Duke in the intimate small dining room, away from the prying eyes of the local gentry. What began as an act of obligation quickly shifted into a delicate magnetic dance of minds and hearts. Arthur discovered that Clara was far from an uneducated servant. Her late father had been a disgraced scholar who had taught her Latin, French, and literature before his untimely death left her family destitute. She possessed a sharp, incisive mind, questioning Arthur's economic strategies for the estate and offering surprisingly practical insights into the lives of the working tenant farmers. In turn, Clara saw past the Duke's formidable exterior. She observed him working late into the night over dusty account ledgers in his study, driven not by personal greed, but by a deep, agonizing sense of duty to protect the dozens of tenant families who depended on Oakridge for their livelihoods. One afternoon, as heavy snow fell softly past the tall leaded windows of the library, Arthur joined her by the grand stone fireplace. He held 2 cups of steaming tea, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, a tiny electric point of contact that sent a sudden warmth rushing through Clara's veins. You look far away today, Clara, he said softly, sitting in the leather armchair opposite her. I was thinking of my mother, she confessed, her amber eyes reflecting the dancing flames. And of how fragile safety is. In Mayfair, one misstep meant starvation. Here, it feels like a dream I am destined to wake from. It is no dream, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. You saved me from a catastrophic mistake, Clara. Had I married Evelyn Vance, my home would have been saved, but my soul would have been crushed under the weight of a lie. Yet your debts remain, Your Grace, she reminded him gently, looking down at her hands. The bank notices are still on your desk. Protecting me has cost you the Vance fortune. You need an heiress, not a former lady's maid with no dowry." Arthur leaned forward, placing his cup on the table. His dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart leap against her ribs. "I spent 10 years in the Queen's army, believing that duty was the only noble purpose in life. But these past 2 weeks with you have taught me that a life without truth and without feeling is merely a slow death. I would rather fight the banks line by line than sell my life to a shadow." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The romantic tension between them had grown unbearable, built on quiet glances across dining tables, shared laughter over old manuscripts, and the deep, mutual respect of two souls who understood sacrifice. Arthur reached out, his warm, strong hand gently resting over hers on the armrest of her chair. "Arthur," she whispered, using his Christian name for the very first time. A quiet knock at the door shattered the moment. Arthur pulled his hand back reluctantly as his butler, Mr. Higgins, entered bearing a silver tray. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," Higgins said nervously. "A packet has just arrived by express courier from a legal firm in Mayfair. It is marked urgent and confidential regarding the late Dowager Duchess's trust." Arthur frowned, taking the sealed parchment envelope. He broke the red wax seal and unfolded the document. As his eyes scanned the formal calligraphy, his expression shifted from curiosity to utter astonishment. "What is it?" Clara asked, rising from her seat, alarmed by his sudden stillness. Arthur looked up from the letter, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound confusion as he looked at her. "This document. It is a codicil to my grandmother's will, hidden in a London vault for 20 years, Arthur said, his voice hollow. "It states that a secret portion of the Blackwood estate, a vast diamond property in South Africa, was left in trust to her lost daughter. A daughter who eloped with a common scholar named Sterling." Clara felt the room spin beneath her feet. "Sterling?" Arthur stepped toward her, holding the document with a trembling hand. "Clara, your father wasn't just a scholar. He was the husband of Lady Margaret Ravenel. You are not a servant. Clara, you are my mother's brother's long-lost child. You are an heiress to the Blackwood bloodline." The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing sharp crimson shadows across the silent library. Clara backed away from the desk, her breath coming in shallow, frightened gasps. The parchment in Arthur's hand seemed to glisten like a curse rather than a gift. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside the leaded windows. "No, that is impossible. My father was a quiet, modest man who taught languages in a small terrace house in Lambeth. He had no noble blood. He died with 4 shillings in his coat pocket." "His name was Julian Sterling," Arthur said, his tone laced with a fierce, bewildered intensity as he walked slowly toward her, the legal document trembling in his grip. "He disappeared from London society in 1863 after eloping with Lady Margaret Ravenel, my late aunt. The family erased her name from the parish registers to avoid a public scandal. Clara, the dates, the signatures, the personal seal of the 9th Earl. It is all here. Then my whole life, my mother's suffering, our poverty, my years on my knees scrubbing floors in Mayfair." Clara's voice broke as tears welled in her amber eyes, burning with a mixture of betrayal and grief. "It was all a lie? My father let us starve in the shadows of London while his family sat in marble halls. He hid her to protect her from them," Arthur said gently, reaching out, his warm fingers barely touching her arm. "My grandfather threatened to disown anyone who spoke her name, but my grandmother. She secretly secured a portion of her personal fortune in a South African trust, bound only to Margaret's legal heir. Clara, you are not merely an invited guest. You own half of the mineral rights that feed this estate. You are Lady Clara Ravenel." Instead of comfort, a cold panic washed over Clara. The fragile, beautiful bridge that had been building between them over the past fortnight suddenly felt shattered. Before, she was a penniless girl bound to him by shared honesty and an unexpected, forbidden affection. Now, she was his cousin, a blood relative, whose sudden appearance threatened to overturn the legal foundation of the Blackwood lineage. "If I am who this paper says I am," Clara said, stepping back into the shadow of the velvet curtains, "then society will not see a romantic truth, Arthur. They will see a disgraceful scandal. They will say the Duke of Blackwood harbored a secret illegitimate relative to seize her hidden fortune and pay off his father's debts." Before Arthur could answer, the door to the library was thrown open without warning. Standing on the threshold, dripping rain onto the plush Persian rug, was Lady Augusta Ravenel, the Dowager Countess of Sussex, Arthur's formidable, sharp-tongued aunt, flanked by none other than Mr. Thomas Vance and a slick London solicitor wearing a high silk hat. "So it is true," Lady Augusta sneered, her gold-handled lorgnette raised to her eye as her icy gaze swept from Arthur to Clara. "The magnificent Duke of Blackwood has turned Oakridge Manor into an asylum for common impostors and ambitious servant girls." "Aunt Augusta," Arthur said, his voice instantly dropping into a tone of icy steel as he stepped defensively in front of Clara. "You cross my threshold uninvited, accompanied by a man I banished from this house." "I came to save this family from utter ruin," Augusta snapped, her heavy silk dress rustling aggressively as she marched into the center of the room. "Mr. Vance brought word to Mayfair that you rejected his daughter's marriage settlement in favor of a maidservant. I thought it was the raving of an insulted merchant until his solicitor produced the records of your recent financial collapse. The banks are foreclosing on Oakridge in 14 days, Arthur." "That is my affair, Aunt," Arthur replied coldly. "And Miss Sterling's presence here is entirely legitimate." "Is it?" Mr. Vance stepped forward, a triumphant, malicious sneer twisting his features. "Your Grace, I spent the last 3 days searching the parish records in Lambeth and Mayfair. This girl's mother is alive, living in a hovel in Southwark. She signed a confession this morning before a magistrate, for a modest sum, of course." Clara felt her blood run cold. "What have you done to my mother?" she demanded, stepping out from behind Arthur, her eyes blazing. The London solicitor stepped forward, pulling a stamped court order from his leather briefcase. "Miss Sterling, or whatever you choose to call yourself, your mother has formally sworn under oath that you were born 6 months before any alleged marriage ceremony took place between Julian Sterling and Lady Margaret. Furthermore, she admits that Julian Sterling was never legally married to the late Earl's sister, as Lady Margaret died of fever in Italy 2 years prior to your birth." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. "She is a bastard," Lady Augusta declared mercilessly, her voice cutting through the air like a silver blade. "An illegitimate child with no legal right to the Blackwood name, no right to any trust, and no right to step foot in this house. The document you hold, Arthur, is null and void without proof of a lawful marriage." "You paid her to sign that!" Clara cried out, her chest heaving, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "My mother would never—" "Your mother was desperate and starving, girl," Vance sneered. "And now the entire London press has been informed of this sordid little drama. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper from Mayfair to Manchester will carry the story of how the proud Duke of Blackwood tried to pass off a common-born bastard as a noble heiress to trick his creditors." Arthur took a lethal step toward Vance, his hands clenched into fists, his military bearing radiating absolute fury. "Get out of my house before I have my men throw you into the snow." "We are leaving, Your Grace," Vance smirked, backing toward the door alongside the solicitor. "But the scandal is already born. The banks will not wait. Your reputation is destroyed. You will be auctioned off by the courts before the month is out." As the heavy doors slammed shut behind the uninvited guests, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the library. Lady Augusta turned to Arthur, her expression devoid of pity. "You have one choice left, Arthur. You must publicly denounce this girl tonight. Cast her out, sign a statement declaring you were the victim of an elaborate fraud, and agree to marry Lady Beatrice in Sussex by spring. It is the only way to save the Blackwood name." Arthur did not look at his aunt. His eyes were fixed entirely on Clara. Clara stood in the center of the room, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She saw the crushing weight of centuries of noble tradition resting on Arthur's broad shoulders. She saw the shadow of total ruin hanging over his estate, his tenant farmers, and his honor. If he defended her, he would lose everything he had spent his life trying to protect. If he kept her here, society would drag his name through the mud forever. "Clara," Arthur said softly, taking a step toward her, his dark eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing warmth. "Look at me." "No," Clara whispered, wiping the tears from her face, her voice steadying with a sudden, tragic resolve. She looked at him, the man who had offered her his hand when she was a nameless stranger, the man who had shown her respect and loved her mind before he ever knew her bloodline. "Your duty is to your house, Arthur. You cannot fight the whole world for a shadow." Before he could reach her, Clara turned and ran out of the library, her slippers gliding silently across the polished floors, fleeing toward her chamber as the cold winter wind battered the manor walls, leaving Arthur standing alone at the edge of an abyss. The northern storm howled against the stone turrets of Oakridge Manor, driving thick sheets of snow across the dark, desolate moors. Inside her bedchamber, Clara packed her small leather satchel with trembling hands. She left behind the silk gowns and delicate lace Arthur had provided, keeping only her threadbare servant's cloak and the brass lockets containing portraits of her parents. She could not allow Arthur to ruin his ancient house, his name, and his tenants for the sake of a disgraced girl whose very existence brought scandal. Stepping out into the freezing midnight air through a side servant's entrance, Clara pulled her hood low against the biting wind. The snow crunched beneath her thin leather boots as she trudged down the winding carriage drive, intending to walk to the village station 3 miles away and disappear forever into the grey haze of London. In the grand hall, Lady Augusta stood near the hearth, wrapping her fur stole tightly around her shoulders as Arthur descended the marble staircase, dressed in his heavy military riding coat and tall leather boots. "Arthur, be reasonable," Augusta demanded, her voice sharp with aristocratic indignation. "Where are you going in this blizzard? The girl has done the only sensible thing by fleeing. Let her go back to the gutter where she belongs. If you chase after her, society will brand you a fool and a lunatic." Arthur stopped at the foot of the stairs, his dark eyes burning with an absolute, unyielding clarity that silenced his aunt instantly. "For 10 years, Aunt Augusta, I lived by the narrow demands of pride and society," Arthur said, his deep baritone echoing through the ancient hall with formidable weight. "I watched my father destroy this family's honor while wearing silk and diamonds. Clara Sterling possesses more true nobility in her smallest finger than the entire peerage combined. If Oakridge Manor can only be saved by selling my soul and abandoning the woman I love to the winter cold, then let the house fall." Without another word, Arthur cast open the heavy oak doors, stepping directly into the roaring tempest. He mounted his dark stallion, Achilles, and galloped into the blinding white night. Halfway down the desolate moorland road, Clara's strength faltered. The freezing snow blinded her, and the icy wind cut through her thin woolen cloak like steel needles. Her feet grew numb, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as her knees buckled against a drift of heavy snow. Sinking to the frozen earth beside a fallen stone wall, she pulled her satchel close, her eyelids growing heavy under the weight of the freezing cold. Through the roaring storm, the rhythmic thunder of hooves echoed across the valley. A shadow burst through the veil of snow. Arthur leapt down from his stallion before the beast had even come to a full halt, plunging through the snowdrifts until he reached her shivering form. He dropped to his knees, scooping her up into his broad, warm chest, wrapping his heavy, fur-lined coat tightly around her trembling shoulders. "Clara!" he called out, his voice choked with emotion, his warm breath fanning across her frozen cheeks. "Clara, look at me. Open your eyes." Clara forced her eyelids open, her amber eyes meeting his through a blur of frost and tears. "Arthur," she whispered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Why? Why did you come? You must save your house." "You are my house, Clara," Arthur declared fiercely, his hands framing her cold face, his thumb gently wiping away a frozen tear. "There is no home for me in this world without you. I do not care about the money, the titles, or the whispers of Mayfair. I love you, Clara Sterling. I have loved you since the moment you looked me in the eye and told me the terrifying, beautiful truth." Tears spilled anew from Clara's eyes, hot against her frozen skin, as the sheer weight of his devotion washed over her. "They will destroy you, Arthur. They call me a bastard. Then let them call us whatever they wish," Arthur murmured, leaning down to press his lips against hers in a passionate, desperate kiss that seemed to ignite a fire through the freezing night. The kiss carried the heat of unspoken vows, the strength of protection, and the absolute promise of a shared future. He lifted her easily into his arms, carrying her onto his horse, and rode back through the storm to Oakridge Manor. The following morning, the snow ceased, revealing a brilliant, sunlit expanse of white across Yorkshire. But the real thaw began inside the Duke's study. Arthur had summoned his legal counsel from Leeds, along with the village rector who held the old parish archives of St. Jude's. While Mr. Vance had bribed Clara's desperate mother into signing a misleading affidavit regarding dates, Arthur's solicitors uncovered an unassailable truth in the original church register. Julian Sterling and Lady Margaret Ravenel had indeed been legally married by special license in a private chapel in Sussex 3 months before Clara's birth. The Italian fever had been a rumor manufactured by Arthur's grandfather to cover up the elopement. Clara was no bastard. She was the legitimate, sole surviving heiress to Lady Margaret's South African trust. When Mr. Vance and Lady Augusta arrived at noon, expecting to find a ruined duke preparing for surrender, they were instead met in the drawing room by Arthur and Clara, who sat side by side on a velvet sofa, their hands folded together in quiet, unshakable unity. Arthur tossed a bound stack of legal documents onto the mahogany table before them. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said calmly, his hand firmly holding Clara's, "these documents confirm Miss Sterling's legitimate birth and her immediate inheritance of £60,000 from the Blackwood Trust. My solicitors have already transferred the funds to clear every mortgage on Oakridge Manor. Your services and your attempted extortion are no longer required." Vance's face drained of all colour, his lips trembling as he stared at the signed documents bearing the High Court seal. "Your Grace, I was misinformed. You will leave Yorkshire by the 3 o'clock train." Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet steel. "If you ever approach Clara, her mother, or this estate again, I will personally see that the Fraudulent Transfers Act is enforced against your firm." Vance bowed frantically and fled the room, his dignity completely shattered. Lady Augusta stood frozen, staring at Clara with a mix of shock and defeated pride. Clara rose slowly, her posture regal, her amber eyes soft yet firm with a dignity that no wealth could buy. "Lady Augusta," Clara said gently, her voice ringing clear across the room, I do not seek revenge against a family that hid my father's memory. But I will not allow this house to be ruled by fear and deceit any longer. If you wish to remain a welcome guest at Oakridge, you will treat my mother, who shall be moving into the dower house this spring, with the respect she deserves." Augusta looked from Clara's proud, composed face to Arthur's resolute expression. Realizing the tide of history had turned, the Dowager Countess offered a slight, reluctant inclination of her head before quietly exiting the room. 6 months later, in June of 1889, the bells of St. Jude's Church chimed joyfully across the sunlit green hills of Yorkshire. The wedding was not a grand, cold spectacle of Mayfair ambition, but a warm, intimate celebration attended by the local tenant farmers, villagers, and those few true friends who valued honor over empty titles. Clara walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, carrying wild clover and white roses from the manor garden. Her mother sat in the front pew, weeping tears of joy, her days of poverty and shadow banished forever. When Clara reached the altar, Arthur took her hand. He smiled, the same genuine, radiant smile he had offered her on that stormy November night when she was just a wet, terrified servant girl standing in his grand hall. "My Duchess," Arthur whispered softly as the priest began the vows. "My lord," Clara replied, her heart brimming with a deep, everlasting warmth. Love in the Victorian age was so often weighed on scales of gold, carved into marriage settlements, and traded for social standing within cold, glittering ballrooms. Yet, true nobility was never found in the ancient titles etched into marble walls or the fortunes hidden in bank vaults. It lived in the quiet courage to speak the truth when lies were easier, the strength to sacrifice everything for duty, and the grace to recognize that the most precious inheritance of all is a heart that loves without condition. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and forbidden love touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more unforgettable stories from the grand halls of Victorian England. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Is true love worth risking everything for?